Okay, so let's finish up our lesson on explanation points. So we used Matthew 4 as an example. Let's get into next methods of explanation. So what are some ways that we explain? What are some methods of explanation? And again, I get this from Dr. Chappell. He has an excellent book on this, but he gives 5 ways that we explain. And I want to use as an example for this, Ephesians 3, it's 17. Yeah. It's a little clearer in the original, but this phrase, you are rooted and grounded in love. You could say, who are rooted and grounded in love, or you are rooted and grounded in love. Okay. You are rooted and grounded in love. So he gives 5 different ways, 5 different examples of explanation. So first is we can simply repeat. Right? We can simply repeat, and you can use more than one of these methods when you do explain. But simply repeating what's in the text, especially if the text is simple. So this isn't as good an example, but especially like in James's sermon from 1 John 4, when it says that God is love. I mean, you can simply start by saying God is love, or the person who does not love does not know God. You can simply say what this means is, if we are not loving people, it demonstrates that we do not know God. Right? I'm just saying what the text says, but just saying it again can often help in explanation. So that's the simplest one. We simply we repeat what's in the text. Number 2 is we can restate what's in the text. So we can say it in a different way. So if we're using rooted and grounded in love, the picture there, Paul is using 2 pictures. He's using rooted, which is like a plant, grounded. You could say he laid the foundation. It's like a building. So if we wanted to restate it, we could say that Christ made us secure in love. That's the picture. He made us secure in love. So I'm saying the same. I'm saying what's in the text. I'm just saying it a little bit of a different way. I'm summarizing it. Okay. Instead of saying he rooted us and grounded us in love, I can just say, I could start by saying, maybe I could repeat it. Christ took us and rooted us in his love. He took us and grounded us in his love. And then I can now let me restate it. What this means is he has secured us in his love. We are rooted like a plant is rooted into the ground. We are grounded like the foundation of a building. See, I'm just saying the same thing the text says. I'm just restating it in a different way. Next, we can define or describe, and this is close to illustration. If we're doing this to rooted and grounded in love, I could say it's like a plant in a building. He sunk our roots deep into his love. He set the firm foundation of his love. The roots sink deep. The foundation is secure. See, I'm defining, I'm describing. So a lot of this is just different ways, and we're just finding ways to say what's already in the text and saying it in a way that's helpful. It helps people understand it. Next is nuance. I'm nuancing, so it's often theological. So nuance means, now what I'm not saying is, that's what I say. I say what I am saying by clarifying what I'm not saying. So I'm doing that for this phrase of you are rooted and grounded in love. I could say, if I repeat it, right? So if I repeat it, we are rooted in Christ's love. We are grounded in Christ's love. It's like the roots of a tree that go deep into the soil. Now let me nuance it. So what Paul is not saying here is that he's not praying that Jesus would love us more, that we would find ourselves to be rooted in his love, that we would find ourselves to be grounded in his love. No, he's praying because we are rooted in his love, because we are grounded in his love. So I'm saying, I'm clarifying. I want to make sure you don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying this. I'm saying something completely different than that. And then lastly, we can argue. We can argue. So this can often be done from the original, from commentaries, things like that. So if I repeated it, I restated it, maybe I nuanced it, I could say, now this is clear in the English. This is me arguing. This is clear in the English, but it's even more clear in the original that this is a description of who we are. This is, Paul writes in the perfect tense here. It's a passive tense verb that he's using, the passive tense participle. What that means is he rooted us. He grounded us in his love. So you see, these are just different mechanics you can use to explain, different methods, right? And you can kind of think through them. A lot of them are kind of self-explanatory as you use them, but it's good to have a list and ask, especially as you're beginning, what do I need to do here? And are there ways I can use all five, right? Sometimes it's very powerful to repeat it, say it a different way. Let me define it. Now, let me make sure I want to clarify. I'm not saying this. I'm actually saying this. Let's dive deeper. Let me argue for a specific point. You can use all five. I wouldn't necessarily suggest it all the time, but you can at least employ more than one, I think.
What Paul? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
What Paul does when he speaks of so the more grace should abound, should we sin more? That kind of rhetorical question. Would you categorize that under or nuance?
Yeah, I think that would be like nuance, right? Should we continue in sin, right? Right. So it's anticipating an objection. So is what I'm saying, because there's so much grace, does that mean we should all sin? No, that's not what I'm saying. Let me clarify. I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm actually saying that grace motivates us to not sin. So that's nuancing. Good example. So let's look quickly at Matthew 4 again. And look at 11 or 4:8 through 11. So if we wanted to repeat this, or especially through verse 10, and my proposition once again is, it's because Christ overcame temptation. He is the only sure hope in our overcoming temptation. So then if I read this text in a narrative, for a narrative, I can say, do you see, this is repeating, let me repeat. Do you see here that Christ overcame temptation? That's all I'm doing. I'm just saying it. Do you see Christ overcame temptation? Let me restate it. Okay. He never gave in. He was steadfast. He was resolute. He did not give in to the devil. I'm just saying the same thing, just in different ways, in different angles. He never said yes to temptation. He was resolute in temptation. He trusted in God in temptation, and he stood firm. He stood fast, and sin had no dominion over him. Okay. So I'm just saying the same thing. I'm just saying it in a few different ways. If I'm defining or describing, I might describe I might say it like this. We didn't describe the temptation moment and why Christ is our refuge. You see that this is, he resisted temptation despite the rising intensity of the temptation. Do you see, he was now on top of the mountain despite the rising intensity. He did not succumb to temptation. Despite repeated temptation, he did not succumb to temptation. Despite hunger, despite being offered the easy path, despite being offered the way out, he did not succumb to temptation. You see, I'm explaining the text, but I'm doing it in a way that's describing more of what's going on, looking at it from a few different angles. So to nuance it, I think we could say, I want to be clear. When I say that Christ was tempted, it's not that he had unholy desires like us. No, in his temptation, His affections never wavered. He did not cease to be God who cannot be tempted with sin. Right? And just to clarify and make a theological statement about the divinity of Christ. And then if I want to argue, maybe if I want to argue the rising temptation or the rising intensity of the temptation, I can say this. Look at the geography. Do you see this? He starts in the wilderness. Then he goes to the pinnacle of the temple. And then he goes to the highest point of all, the mountain, the same kind of mountain that he would be at the end of Matthew's gospel when he said, I have been given authority over everything. That is where he was. And he was offered the easy path out, and he did not succumb. So now I'm arguing from multiple angles, from multiple texts to explain the text. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, Faisal.
Josh, where do we state our proposition? Like
in explanation?
Is it good to state our proposition in explanation? I was listening H.B. Charles' sermon that you gave us, and he to stress his proposition. I think do you think it's good?
Yeah, it can be. What you don't want to feel artificial to people. That's the biggest problem with some of these formal methods is if it feels artificial, and especially if you have a long proposition. Now usually when you're explaining, you're not explaining your proposition, you're explaining your main points, and your main points argue for the proposition, right? So usually you certainly can. Usually you can do in your introduction, you say your proposition, then you say your interrogative. So intro, prop, interrogative, body, and then you can do your prop as a transition. You prop and then main point one, and then you can do prop, main point two, and then you can do prop, main point three, and then end with your conclusion and say your prop again. I think this is a helpful way of doing it. Now, what you don't want to do is just be artificial with it. And if you have a proposition that's easy for people to hear, to memorize, it's rhetorically pleasant, aesthetically pleasant to the ear, then yes, say it again and again and again. Good question. Any other questions before we, that was what I wanted to cover just quickly in about 15 minutes there before we get to our workshop. Any other questions before we do our workshop? Okay, so what you want to do is use your prop, use your main points, look at your text, and ask, what parts of the text do I want to explain, and how can I use different methods of explanation in this text? That's what you want to ask. What parts of the text do I want to explain, and how can I use different methods? So you're weeding out something. You're saying I don't, or Sammy has more of like a text topical sermon type, for instance. So like his first main point is, what is the gospel? And that proves his proposition. So Sammy, for his, he can ask, what parts of the gospel do I want to mention? Or where else in Galatians do I see that? Where in Galatians do I see the gospel defined? And then from there, what can I explain? So those are the kind of things you need to be asking is what explanation for the purpose of proving the prompt, for the purpose of serving the pastoral needs of the sermon, what parts of the text do I need to explain? And by process of elimination, I'm weeding out, and nothing else needs to be explained. Nothing else needs to be explained except for these things. I'm not going to touch on the other elements of the text. Does that make sense what we're doing now?
Yeah.
Good. So this shouldn't be as hard. But let's do 20 minutes. Let's do 20 minutes. If we need more time, we can extend it. 20 minutes, work with your text, work with your partners, And okay. So yeah, work with your partner, your group, work with your text by yourself, and we'll come back in 20 minutes. So we'll make that 1:40. We'll come back, and then we'll talk about your explanation points and how those explanation points are going to prove your proposition and your main points. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and come back together now. Look, several of you have sent me your stuff. I think that's probably a good time to anyone who wants to go over it. We can go over your explanation points together, or if you have a question about something earlier, happy to help you out with that as well.
Josh,
Yes.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Do you want to explain our main point, right?
Yes. So what parts of the text do you need to talk about to prove your proposition and to prove your main point? That's what you're asking.
Yeah, but I think to describe and to explain our main point, we have to study and we have to explain, or we have to exegete the text.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's what we're talking about right now.
Most of us, especially on the back line, most of us are, yeah, we can't exegete our text in this time because it's short.
You can't. Your text are. Oh, got you. So you're.
Start, but
Yes. So
no.
I'm not. What I'm not saying is you need to exegete your entire text right now. I'm saying what parts of the text do you plan on studying more so that you will exegete them? That's what I'm saying. So for instance, Emmanuel, let me pull up I think yours was something like, yeah. So how do we see God's compassion?
Yeah.
How do we see God's compassion towards sinners? So if I were you, I would probably walk through the parable, tell the story of the parable, set the context, walk through the parable. How do we see God's compassion towards sinners? Well, let's look first at the younger brother. So if we do that, then I would start in verse 20. So I would say, to explain God's compassion towards the younger brother, I am going to use verses 20 through 24. Bam. That's it. That's all you're doing. You're just identifying that. And then if you want to say, okay, I want to identify God's compassion towards the older brother, what verses would I use? Well, let me use verses 30 and 31. Right? So although the older brother is accusatory towards the father, well, look at this. Look what all that is mine is yours, right? He's not withholding from the older brother. He's just as compassionate. He's just as kind. His heart for the older brother is the same as his heart for the younger brother. Bam, you did it. That doesn't, I'm not telling you need to exegete your entire text right now. I'm saying, what verses will you use to explain your points? Does that make sense?
Yes, now we understand.
Sounds good, man. Dude, you should have asked me that question 35 minutes ago. So you can work more on that later. We don't have time for you to spend another half hour doing that, but that's basically what you're doing, right? So if you're Yisachar and then you're looking at Revelation 5, do you need to talk about the right hand, right? You have to spend time. Probably not. You probably don't, right? You probably don't have to talk about it's a scroll that has this written on the front and the back. You probably don't need to talk about that, right? You're asking, what points do I need? What verses do I need? What phrases will I use to explain the king is needed? There's a king needed. Okay. What phrases will I explain to say the king is presented? Right. So probably not. You probably don't need to explain who the 4 living creatures are and who the 24 elders are. You need to explain that he is able to take the scroll. You can explain the lamb symbol or the lion symbolism. You can explain the lamb symbolism, that the way he becomes the lion is through his death. You could probably explain the 7 horns and the 7 eyes and how that relates to his kingship, things like that, right? So you're just saying like what parts of the text am I going to explain, which then narrows your focus so that you're saying I don't have to explain all the others.
Thank you. Josh?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can I understand what you're saying? Thank you. That's helpful. But can I do it later on? Because I can't write my sermon in this kind of context.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. So I'm not asking you to write your whole sermon right now. I'm just asking you to be aware, what verses do I need to explain? That's all. And you can, I'm not saying that everything's done. Like you can't go back and revisit this. Like you can go back and redo your prop if you want to after the whole class is over, right? It's not like this is written in stone. You know, I'm just giving you the context to think through it.
So you want me to do to explain a verse or two?
No, I'm not asking you to even explain verses right now. I'm asking you to just look at the text and ask, what verses do I need to explain? What verses do I need? What phrases, what verses do I need to explain to get this done? So do I need to explain the harp, the golden bowl full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints? Maybe you just need to decide that. Is that going to be a distraction from what you're trying to say? Because remember, a sermon is not a running commentary. A sermon is trying to have the text serve the pastoral needs of the church. So I'm trying to narrow my focus. What parts of the text serve my proposition? What parts of the text distract me from my proposition? Yeah, so this is just like every other workshop, right? So you're thinking through it, trying to do the best you can with it, and then we'll talk about it together if you want some help with it. Happy to do that with you.
Sorry, just 1 minute. Absent.
Okay. Yep, I got it. Let me see here. Rejoice in suffering. Why rejoice in suffering? Sharing Christ. Do not be surprised. Good. Yeah. Don't be surprised, right? Because Christ also suffered. The God met suffer. Why should not? Good. That's exactly right. And you're using an example of Jesus in the garden. That's perfect. Nothing strange is happening to you. Rejoice. If you're repeating that, sharing in Christ's suffering, nuance. We're not atoning for our sins. That's perfect. And that doesn't require like a lengthy explanation either. That can be a quick nuance. What I don't mean is we're atoning for our sins. What I do mean is that as we, as the body of Christ, suffer, we experience what Christ experienced, something like that, right? So rejoice and be glad. Good. When his glory is revealed, the second coming of Christ. Good. You are blessed in time of suffering. Mistaken, you are blessed, and the Spirit of God is with you. I'm not sure how that comes from. Yeah. I'm not sure how that, if that's the main point that you're trying to make, I'm not sure how being blessed, or unless you're saying that it's a good thing to suffer like Christ suffered. If that's the case, that's more application. But just make sure whatever part of the text you're explaining the main point. So then main point 2, being purified in suffering, to test you. God's purifying us. Good. And then you have a cross-reference. Fantastic. Righteous is going to be saved. Good. Yeah. And you don't spend as much time there, and you shouldn't. I really, that second one doesn't serve your purpose as much. So then if God is faithful, so entrust your soul to him. He's the creator, described as sovereignty. Good. If he's sovereign, then he can be faithful. God is faithful, described covenant faithfulness. Good. Covenant faithfulness, suffering servants will show his faithfulness. My friend, I think this is great. This is exactly what we're looking for, right? So you're thinking through what parts of the text am I going to explain? What parts am I not going to explain? And you've thought through how to say it a few different ways. What parts do you need to nuance? What parts do you need to cross-reference? This is great, my friend. Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, guys, so we're talking about the elements of a sermon's body, right? So we've talked about explanation, which is answering the question, where do you get that, right? Where do you get that in the text? An explanation serves the purpose of application. But there are times that we need illustrations also. There are times we need illustrations. So illustrations simply look at the idea from another angle. You simply ask, what's another way of saying that? Not an explanatory way, but that serves the explanatory purpose of the sermon, or serves the applicatory purpose of the sermon. So it seeks to, through stories, through pictures, through quotations, things like that, help make better connections between the text and the audience, or between the application and the audience. So it helps me when I'm illustrating explanation. It helps me understand difficult cultural things, understand difficult phrases, right? It's just another tool for explanation when we use illustrations, or if it's illustrating an application, then it shows me how the application can be done. First of all, I hope you're not the kind of person that you have to edit out that kind of content. You have to think, do I tell this story or not? Hopefully you're never in the boat that you wonder, would it be appropriate to tell a story about me punching a kid in the chest? Probably not. But if you ever are, don't. All right, we'll talk about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate for illustrations. But first, let's talk about why we illustrate. Why do we illustrate? And let's start with why we don't. Why we don't.
To entertain.
Yeah, to entertain. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's not about entertaining. When we do it to entertain, people feel manipulated. People often feel manipulated. We end up losing their trust. If we just get up there and start telling jokes or silly stories that seem unrelated, or even if they are related, they're done in such a way that it feels whimsical. A lot of times it just sets low expectations for the rest of the sermon. People begin to wonder, where are we going with this? Will we go anywhere helpful? Hopefully my YouTube videos haven't done that to you. Hopefully you haven't thought, no, I thought Josh had good stuff. Now I'm convinced that he doesn't. No, we don't do it to entertain. We don't do it to manipulate either. Right. So I gave the example earlier of the preacher who told an overly emotional story about the kid having the explosion in his face. Right. We don't do it to manipulate people's emotions. We don't do it to entertain. Another one is to give people a break, or a breath of air. I've heard this often before too. We illustrate because people are just, the sermon is hard to get through, it's just a lot of explanation, and the illustrations just kind of give people an opportunity to breathe in the sermon. Like it gives people an opportunity to turn their brains off for a moment and just to kind of hear a funny story. Now, can it serve a purpose like that? Does it engage different parts of our brains? It absolutely engages different parts of our brains, but we don't schedule illustrations, every 7 minutes, because adult attention spans are low. And so every 7 minutes we need to put an illustration in. I've been part of a preaching class where I've been taught to do something like that before. That's not the purpose of illustrations. And in fact, you can probably have a good sermon that has no illustrations. You don't have to have illustrations. You can, and they help, but they only help when they're appropriate. So then why do we do illustrations? Does anyone remember what Brian Chappell said? What's the primary reason?
To support our idea.
Now that's certainly a good reason. That's not what he gives. Does anyone remember what he said?
Illustrate, and then apply.
Yeah, so I do think that that's the reason, or that is a good reason. But Dr. Chappell, for instance, says we do it to motivate. He says we do it to motivate, which I think is part of it. I think that's part of it. So illustrations help connect emotionally with people, right? Stories connect emotionally with people in ways that explanation doesn't. It gives examples of what it looks like to live this kind of life. It gives emotional, it lets people get emotionally connected with you, with your message. But I think if we stop there, it leaves more to be desired. Really, what we do is we want to make the text clear. Or we can say we want to make the text more clear. That's why we illustrate. We illustrate because there are parts of the text that are difficult to understand. And we don't think explanation alone properly helps the audience understand what we're saying. There's more that could be said. There's more ways we could talk about it. So an example of this, an example might be, if we're talking about, I think I used this example in your hermeneutics class. If we're talking about the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, we might, people might not understand fully what the connotations of being a Pharisee or a tax collector are. So we could explain, right? A Pharisee, that's a religious leader. This is somebody who knows the Bible inside and out. If anyone had a relationship with God, it was them. Okay, that's explanation. And a tax collector. And this is somebody who was thought low of in society. They were thought to have stolen. They would come to your door and demand more. They would demand that you would give more even than the government asked for. Okay, sure. But and that's explanation. Now I can explain the text further with an illustration by saying it's like the story of if we were to say this in modern terms, it'd be like the story of the Pente and the secular music artist. Okay, now you explain it in a way that I get what you're saying now, right? You have or you could even say the seminary professor and the secular music artist, the person who should be at the top of their spiritual game, and the person who we think of as the lowest of the low when it comes to their spiritual life, right? So that quick illustration helps drive home the point. I'm using it as an explanatory tool. I'm not using it just to tell stories. So we do it to make the text more clear. We also we want to make the application more clear. We want to make the application more clear. And part of this is motivating. Part of this can be done to motivate. When I was preaching at Trinity back in the summer, I believe, I'll give two examples. One is David Livingstone. So I was preaching about the need to, my prop that I was using was work faithfully for the progress of the kingdom and wait patiently for the fullness of the kingdom. Work faithfully, wait patiently. Work faithfully, wait patiently. And I was saying that several times. Then I gave an example for David Livingstone. Worked faithfully on the mission field of India for 6 years before he saw his first convert. And then he baptized that convert, and I gave a quotation from his journal where he was convinced that if God's divine power could save one man, it could save 100,000. And then he quoted the text that I was preaching: the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the water covers the sea. And then I finished that illustration by saying, this is an example of working faithfully and waiting patiently. For 6 years, he saw no fruit, but he waited and he worked and he was faithful. So that makes the application more clear. Right? I'm illustrating the application, and then by consequence, I'm motivating. People are like, that I want to be like that. right? It's not this abstract idea of working faithfully and waiting patiently. I know it's concrete. I have a story in mind, and that's what people are going to walk away with. It's that story. Oh, that David Livingstone story. I want to be like that. Another example is I use an example of a marriage conflict when I was preaching a sermon from Leviticus 10 on coming to God only through Christ, not anything in us. And I told a story about a husband and a wife who had a conflict. She became angry. He kept his cool. He never got angry. She storms into another room and he just sits on the couch and he sits there and he thinks, man, our marriage needs help right now. And I really feel like I can pray to God right now because I did not get angry. I kept my cool. I did a good job. I didn't get angry like my wife. And so now let me pray to God about our marriage. Well, what's he trusting in? He's trusting in his works to give him access to God instead of Christ, right? And then I said, she, on the other hand, is in the bedroom, maybe crying, and she's thinking, oh my goodness, our marriage needs help. And I wish that I could pray, but I can't pray because I just got angry. And God won't hear my prayer because I just got angry at my husband. And then I said, what's the problem for both of them? The problem for both of them is that they're looking to their works instead of to Christ to give them access to God. Both the husband who didn't get angry and the wife who did. I think I asked the question, which of them has more access to God right now? Which of them has more access to God? Neither. Neither has more access to God because both of them, because they're Christians, can come to God through Christ. So that's making an application point more clear. So you can do it to make a explanation point more clear, or to make an application point more clear. So once we understand that that's the purpose of illustration, we can ask, when do we illustrate? When do we illustrate? We illustrate either for explanation or application, but we do it to make our point more clear. We do it to make our application point more clear or our explanation point more clear, not for the purpose of telling a funny story, not for the purpose of entertaining, not because we want to grab people's attention again. We do it to make our point more clear. It serves the application point of the sermon. It serves the explanation point of the sermon. Any questions on that? If not, we'll get into practicals for how do we illustrate. Okay, so how do we illustrate? How do we illustrate? Let's talk first about how to introduce an illustration. And so this is in your presentation. And again, most of this comes from Dr. Chappell in his excellent book. Most of this course is kind of a blend between Dr. Chappell, Jeff Purswell, and some of my own ideas. But he suggests that you fit it into, you illustrate like this. If it's an explanation illustration, you do your explanation, you illustrate, and then you can make a final explanation or a final explanatory comment. Okay, so I'll give you an example of this. I was preaching a sermon on the love of Christ from Ephesians 3, and I was making the point that oftentimes I think the reason we don't experience the love of Christ, or we don't feel the love of Christ, is because we feel like it's too good to be true. It's so amazing we feel like it's too good to be true. And I use an example from the Chronicles of Narnia, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So I talked about how we feel like it's too good to be true sometimes. Now I'm giving an illustration where they get to an island. And once they arrive at the island, there's this massive feast prepared around a table, and no one's sitting at the table. It's just full of empty chairs. And they think, oh my goodness, this looks like the most amazing feast. It's the most amazing food. I wonder who this could be for. What they end up finding out later is that it was the feast was prepared for them, but they didn't eat it because they thought it was too good to be true. And then follow that up. Now I'm back to explanation, a final explanation point. Do we feel like that with the love of Christ sometimes? I'm making the point explicit. I'm not just telling a story, I'm making it explicit. Do we feel like that with the love of Christ sometimes? That we think there's no way it's for me. Well, let me tell you, the entrance fee is free, and it is available and open, and it is spread for every believer. Something like that. So it's good, it's helpful to explain, illustrate, explain, or apply, illustrate, apply. So it's helpful to sandwich it so your point is a little bit easier to understand. Now, on that, it's helpful to use complete stories. So it's helpful to use complete stories. So if you are using a story, especially maybe a story about yourself or a story about someone who is in a bad situation, something like that, maybe you tell a story about a family camping outing or something where something negative happens. There's some kind of conflict in the story. You don't want to end the illustration before the conflict is resolved, even if the resolution of the conflict isn't the point of your story. So for instance, maybe you tell a story about your father, and maybe you're making an application illustration. You're talking about being faithful to Christ in suffering. And you tell a story about your father who was diagnosed with cancer, and in his cancer diagnosis, he found that and maybe like he was going in, or no, let's do heart surgery. Your father needed heart surgery. He goes into the doctor, into surgery, and the doctor had very low hopes of him surviving the surgery. And your father found nearness to Christ in that, right? And as he was going into that heart surgery, not sure if he would make it out, he felt that his prayers were more fervent than ever. Into the illustration. Well, what's everyone thinking? What's everyone thinking in the audience? Did he live? That's what everyone's thinking. Are you saying your father died? Well, you can complete the story, even though the story isn't part of what you're illustrating. You can say, and by God's mercy, he made it out of the surgery alive. And he would tell you today that was the time he felt especially near to God in the moment of uncertainty. You finish the story so that you don't leave people hanging, people wondering what ended up happening to people in the story. So use complete stories will be and some advice. Don't make ourselves the heroes of the story. Don't make yourself the hero of the story. So if your illustrations, if you're illustrating, this is one thing that I stick with. If I'm using an illustration and I am the subject of the illustration, I am always put in a negative light, never in a positive light. I always make fun of myself. I don't make myself the hero of the story, or if I do, I tend to preface it with the awkwardness of it. Or even say something like, no, you know me, I try not to use myself in illustrations, but I think that this is a good example. And then you can use yourself. I think Michael did that the other day with one of his sermons when he talked about his prayer journal and how prayer helped him get clarity on a certain trial or situation. But he prefaced it by saying now I try not to make myself the subject of these illustrations for a reason, but I think this is a helpful explanation. Another one is don't use our children too much. Brian and James. It's very easy to want to use your kids in the illustrations, and the problem with that is people who don't have kids don't relate, and no one cares about your kids as much as you do. You might think that people care about your kids. You might think that people should care about your kids, but the reality is you care more about your kids than anyone else in the room, and they are going to get bored if you keep telling stories about your kids all the time. Make sure it doesn't get too long. So I think it's always good to manuscript your illustrations. If you're telling a story, you want to make sure you tell the parts of the story that need to be told and nothing more. So you say what you're going to say, you make the point, you don't say anything else. So you can manuscript it, and then it's good to tell the story, not reading it, just tell the story. But if you manuscript it first, you know what parts of the story you're going to mention, you know what parts of the story you're not going to mention. That ensures that a 30-second illustration doesn't become a 5-minute illustration, and all of a sudden now you don't have as much time to apply the text because you just took too long with that illustration. Now another thing, be careful what you reveal. Be careful what you reveal in illustrations also. So we could say, be careful what you reveal about others. Be careful what you reveal about others. So when you talk about other people in illustrations, you should always ask their permission first. You should always ask their permission first. If you're going to talk about someone and name them, you should always say, do you mind if I tell this story? Even if it's a good story, because what you don't want is someone to be embarrassed, even if they're the hero of the story. If it's your wife, your children, if it's someone in the church, if it's even a pastor or something like that, you should come to them and say, I think this is a good illustration. I think this is going to help people. Would you mind if I put this in the sermon? And hardly ever will someone say no. Or if they do say no, you can ask them, well, do you mind if I use this as an illustration without naming you? Is that okay? Well, sure, that's fine. Most people are fine with that. So that's if somebody is in the audience that you're using as an example. But even if someone's not in the audience, you want to be careful. You want to be careful who might listen to the sermon, especially if it's recorded or if someone hears about an illustration. So I'll give an example. I had a friend who preached a sermon, and he used an illustration about, I think he was illustrating something about an unwanted gift. And he used the illustration about how in his, when he got married, him and his wife received a gift of a little garden angel. This is something you need to understand about, especially white people, not just Americans, but white Americans. I don't know why this is. James is from a part of the country that likes these things more than the part of the country that I'm from, but they like to put like junk in their yard. And when I say junk, I mean like a gnome, I don't know, like this is an example of like a garden angel, like it's like a stone angel, like a cheap plastic fountain, maybe even like a plastic ball. I don't know what, James, help me out here. Have you observed this about your part of the country?
You would love this, Josh. A little flagpole that says bless.
Yes, a flagpole that says blessed. Yeah, things like that. Yeah, I don't know why they like put in their front yard. They just like put in their front yard. It's just a bunch of junk. And then you get to some neighborhoods where, I mean, it's just like to the nth degree. Like I've walked through neighborhoods in the US, and it's always white people. It's always white people. And they'll have like 20 like little garden gnomes in their front yard, and they're all like this tall. And they're just everywhere in the entire front. It's like, why do you have such, this is junk anyway. So this guy in my class he told me this story about how he got a garden angel. It was a statue of an angel, like this naked baby angel with like a bow and arrow. And someone gave that to him as a wedding present to put in his front yard. Now he's the kind of guy who he doesn't want a bunch of junk like this in his front yard. And he definitely doesn't want a naked little baby angel in his front yard. And so he was telling the story about how he got this present, and he thought, this is the stupidest gift I've ever got. I will never use it. What are they thinking? And so you know what I did with the gift? We had a gift exchange with some people in our church, and I gave it to someone as a joke because it was so bad. I knew that I didn't want it. I knew the other person didn't want it. I gave it to them as a joke, and now they had to figure out what to do with it. Well, the bad news was the person who gave him that angel listened to the recording of the sermon. And he found out because one of his friends said, hey, they listened to the sermon. You need to call them and talk to them about this because now they are angry. Okay, so you want to be careful when you use others in your illustrations. It's an awkward place for everyone to be in. When you use your wife in illustration, this is something, I don't know if this is a problem in your culture. This is a problem in my culture. People will say, and this was in the Ignatius video I showed you, people will say, my beautiful wife, my smoking hot wife, my attractive wife. I personally have a bit of an allergy towards that because immediately, as soon as someone says that, everyone in the crowd starts evaluating whether or not he's right about that statement, right? It's an awkward moment for everyone involved. So I try to shy away from objectifying my wife in public. She feels uncomfortable. The audience feels uncomfortable. No one is benefited from that. When you, yes.
Do you think there are some passage in the scripture that we don't preach, like Matthew 10:13, that says even your hair in your head is counted if we preach it in our church?
What did it?
So use Michael as an example, yeah. Or you might if you have a church of only bald people, you might need to use an illustration. Now I know none of you are familiar with this, but there's a thing called hair. Let me tell you about hair, right? Yeah. Or you could even tell Michael.
Even Mikey might offend it.
Right, yeah, Mikey might be greatly offended. Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, so counseling situations. So you'll be a pastor and you'll have plenty of counseling situations in your church. I have plenty of moments of good and bad counseling situations. If you use a sermon illustration of a pastoral, or I was watching a video the other day. There's a pastor and he used a negative example of a church member, even though he didn't name the church member. So he said, I preached the sermon and then one member from my church walked up afterwards and said this to me. And I thought that is unhelpfully dogmatic. That's unhelpfully dogmatic. And he uses a negative example for then where he went on to explain his point. The problem with that, even if you don't name the person, is you set a tone where people are now worried to talk to the pastor. I don't know, maybe I'm going to be the next one who's using an illustration. I don't want to be the next one that the pastor talks about. Or even, what is the pastor thinking about me when I come and talk to him? Is he evaluating me? Is he judging me? Am I going to end up in illustration? Even if all the details are changed, am I going to end up being talked about in an illustration? So be careful what you reveal about others. I think also about yourself. Be careful what you reveal about yourself as well. So we want to be transparent people. I think that it can often be effective when you use illustrations of your own struggles with sin. I think that can be an effective means of illustration. But what you don't want to do is people get out of the illustration and they think, why are we paying this guy? We don't want them to think this guy is the least qualified person to be a pastor, even if out of humility you say things that that maybe are exaggerated out of an expression of humility. You don't want people leaving thinking my pastor is a terrible, terrible, terrible person. If you use yourself as a negative example in illustration, be careful. Be careful what you reveal about yourself, especially, I think, when you talk about your pre-conversion life. So I think there are some things which can be discussed in private conversations that probably should not be addressed from the pulpit. When you talk about your pre-conversion life, if they're embarrassing sin stories or shameful sin stories, it's not that we don't want to walk in the light. It's not that we would never share these kinds of things, but it is that there are some things that if you're not in a private conversation can be misunderstood, or especially if heard by the wrong person. Maybe there's a visitor there that day, and you talk about pre-conversion sin struggles that you had. It can sometimes be unhelpful for people. Next, here's a caution. When you use other people's illustrations. A caution when you use other people's illustrations. So if you hear a sermon and you hear a good illustration from that sermon, can you use it? Yes, absolutely you can. You can, oh, that's a helpful story. I'm going to use that story myself. Now, if it's not about you, don't pretend like it is about you. Like you can say, so this pastor used this example from his own life. If you're at all following the plagiarism stories in the SBC right now, you'll know that there are several preachers who you all use the same illustration as if they were the ones who did it, and that has caused people to scratch their heads and say, who was the one who wrote this illustration originally? Well, what you don't want is to tell a story as if it's your own, if it's not your own. And be careful. Be careful to make sure you understand the illustration. Be careful to be sure if you use someone else's illustration that you understand what's being said. Okay, so I'll use an example. I was listening to a pastor preaching once, and he was talking about this. I mean, it was a very moralistic sermon, and he was talking about the need for Christians to dress nicely. The need for Christians to dress nicely. It's legalistic. It wasn't from the text, but his whole sermon was about how Christians need to dress nicely. And he used an illustration where he said that if he goes to the hospital to visit a sick church member, if he goes to the hospital to visit a sick church member, they won't let him in the room unless he wears a collar. If he wears a collar, then he'll be able to get into the hospital room. And what he thought he meant by that was having a shirt with a collar on it, right? As opposed to a t-shirt like what I'm wearing right now. I was sitting there listening to it, and I immediately thought he was listening to a Catholic priest, someone who's maybe a high church Presbyterian, maybe an Anglican, somebody who wears that little white strip. That is clearly, this is not his illustration. He took it from someone else, and he did not even understand what the person was saying in the illustration. Now, it's fine to use someone else's illustration, but be careful you actually understand what they're talking about. Another caution. When you talk about science, literature, etc., make sure you're accurate. Don't talk about things you don't understand. Don't talk about things you don't understand as if you understand them, because you talk about use an illustration from science and you clearly have no clue what you're talking about, and you simply are using someone else's illustration, and you act like you talk about it authoritatively, and there's someone there who maybe has studied science for a while, and they think, well, if I can't, this is how people come out of it. They think, if I can't trust him to talk about earthly things, how can I trust him to talk about heavenly things? Right? We're trying to build repertoire with people, and when these are examples of how our illustrations do the opposite of that. And we want to be careful. Be careful not to do that. A caution about pop culture. Caution about pop culture references. So our desire might be to resonate with people about what we talk about. We want to be careful, though, that we actually understand the pop culture reference we're making. I've seen plenty of cringe moments where people quote song lyrics or they quote movies, and it's very clear they've never listened to the song. They've never watched the movie. I was watching one. Oh, it makes me, I don't even want to say this because it's so cringeworthy. One pastor who is talking about how Christ is worthy of our lives. And he says, there's this song by this band called Fifth Harmony, and it's called Give It To Me, I'm Worth It. And Jesus says that, give me your life, I'm worth it. And he clearly doesn't understand the song. He clearly doesn't even understand the band that he's quoting either. He understands nothing about it. It just is an embarrassing moment for everyone there. So I've coined the phrase, the John Piper principle. The John Piper principle. If you think about who is the least relevant preacher, maybe in like the history of any preacher I've ever listened to, who's the least relevant person? It's probably John Piper. John Piper is incredibly, he is not relevant in the slightest. He's not relevant. He doesn't watch the latest movies. If you look at his clothing, he's not relevant. If you even look at the way he uses his language, he's not relevant. But young people love him. Young people love him because he's himself. He's authentic. He doesn't pretend to be someone he's not. And so oftentimes, just being who we actually are, not pretending to be someone we're not, is much more effective than trying to pretend we're the most relevant people. Be careful what you describe also. Don't describe things that would be embarrassing for people, and be aware of when I say that. Don't talk about gross details, right? So if you're talking about a horrific historical event as an illustration, don't give gross details about that. Don't give undesirable details. If you probably don't want to use an illustration about changing a diaper and you give undesirable details about that. And think not just about your generation, think about the older people in the room as well. So there'd be some things that would certainly be offensive to older people that wouldn't be as offensive to younger people. You want to make sure you're just appealing to everyone in the room and not being a turnoff to anyone there. Be honest. Be honest in your illustrations. Don't add details that aren't true. Don't tell stories that aren't true. Don't make yourself the hero when you actually weren't the hero. So those are some principles for illustrations, for how we illustrate, or what kinds of illustrations do we use. Any questions on that? I mean, you've got to address what's going on if you want it to be serious, or maybe even adjust the way that you're doing it. But so John Piper would be of the opinion that, at least this last I read up on his opinion on humor in the pulpit, that humor is not appropriate, that the pulpit is a very serious place, not a light place, and so we shouldn't ever joke. My opinion on that is that when the Bible uses humor, it uses it to prove a theological point, or it uses it to prove a point. It doesn't use humor sparingly. It doesn't use humor without intent. And I think that our illustrations can do the same. So I'll give you an example of that. You remember the story of Eglon, the fat king, in Judges, where Ehud comes and stabs him with the sword, and everyone thinks that he's in the bathroom because there's a bad smell that's coming out. All the while Eglon escapes, and it makes a big deal about how fat that he is. He's so fat that the sword goes into his stomach and Ehud can't even pull it out, and it makes a point of his bowels bursting open when it happens, and the guards stand outside the room embarrassed, right? It's a very funny story. It's a very humorous story for the purpose of making fun of the king, for the purpose of showing that it paints the king in an embarrassing light, a humorous, embarrassing light to prove a theological purpose. So I think that Jesus does similar things too. I think that there are times to use humor, but our point isn't to make people laugh. Okay, I'll give you an example. I know I've talked about a lot of my sermons, but go back to Ephesians 3. I used humor in my opening illustration for this one. So the first thing I did was I read the text, I prayed, I read the text, and then I said something brief about how this might be the loftiest of all Pauline prayers, and perhaps the loftiest language of all Pauline prayers. And then I asked like a question, like, do you ever pray like this? I certainly don't pray like this. In fact, and then I gave an illustration. What if you went to lunch after church and you met someone who goes to a different church, and you asked them, how was your service today? And they said, it was amazing. Let me tell you what happened. The Spirit strengthened us. Christ dwelt in our hearts, and we were filled with all the fullness of God. And I just asked, what do you think happened at that sermon? What do you think happened at that service? Like, what comes to mind? And then I kept making fun of myself throughout it. And I kept saying, like, if you're anything like me, you probably think that there was endless prophecies, everyone was speaking in tongues. Someone might even been raised from the dead. There's this charismatic chaos happened. And the pastor probably got up when it was time to preach the sermon, and he said something like, well, I guess there's no time for the sermon today because of all of those charismatic experiences. So go ahead and go home. And you might even be concerned that you might need to help your friend find a new church based on that. And I just kind of, I acknowledge the awkwardness of some of the language here, for the purpose of breaking the ice, and then for the purpose of then asking the question. So what does Paul mean when he says this? And then that kind of drew our attention down to being able to talk about it. I think times like that, it's okay to use humor to prove your point, but you're not being funny for the purpose of being funny. Good question, James. Any other questions about that? Oh, go ahead.
To follow up with that, it kind of just seems like I forget where it was mentioned, but it's like be yourself as your preacher.
Yes.
And I think some of it, like even that story of Eglon, I feel like if I was reading that aloud, we just get in this like frame of like Bible reading, like it has to be serious.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, like, it seems to me like Piper is probably a serious guy. I bet if you had him over for dinner, he'd be serious.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of, I feel like I'm not as serious of a guy. With that being, like,
yeah.
Does that make sense? Like, do we have to make sure we're very sober the whole time, or can we just kind of ourselves?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Being yourself. Like that example of humor that I used for that illustration. I'm a sarcastic person, and I was being myself when I was being sarcastic. What would you? That's a question that me as a sarcastic person would be thinking if I ever heard somebody say that. So I kind of put you in my shoes. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, just be yourself.
Can I go with my questions now?
Yeah, AB, what's up?
So you were saying, be careful of how you describe the vulgar thing, but don't you think sometimes it would serve the sermon to intentionally, for example, like Paul would mention rubbish. I don't think people are pleased when he mentions literal feces in his expression of how he considers that, and he intentionally brings that picture to mind in a way kind of to make them relate how much of a distaste he have for that. So it's not pleasant, but as long as it serves, is it possible to incorporate a vivid pictorial description in the sermon?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is, as long as you're self-aware. So the examples that I was giving is somebody who's not self-aware using gross things in a sermon, and they ended up finding out later there were people who were embarrassed by that story. You know, if you're self-aware and not over the top for the purpose of making a point, and what you don't want to do is you don't want to be known as, like, when people think like this is even 10 years later, when people think Mark Driscoll, they think the cursing preacher, even though I think there was only one time that he cursed from the pulpit. I think when I heard someone who was analyzing his sermons, and I think they said there's only one time he did it, but people still think of him as the cursing preacher. And yeah, you just want to be careful to be self-aware, right? As you're doing it, and with intent, and know that your reputation's on the line when you choose what stories you're going to be telling. And for Driscoll, when he used that illustration, that stuck with him. That stuck with him all of his life. I don't think he'll ever get over that. Good example though, Avi. Very helpful example. Let's talk quotations. So an example of an illustration can be a quotation. So when do we use quotations? I think we use quotations when there's no way I could have said it better myself. There's no way I could have said it better myself. They say it perfectly. They say it succinctly. And why do you use quotations? You don't use quotations because this is a research paper. You use quotations because it helps, because somebody said it better than you ever could. Or if you quote a song, because it helps connect a song people already know to the ideas you're talking about. Or it can help. There are times, I think, when you're talking about a difficult theological topic that people might not be familiar with, that using a quotation can help build some credibility in what you're saying. Help build credibility in what you're saying. So be aware if it's a particularly difficult theological topic that you can quote somebody who's authoritative on it. And people are like, oh, okay, so my pastor isn't the only one who thinks this. That's good.
Josh,
Yes.
I have a quick.
Mhm.
How can we quote something controversy things? For example, when I use my example, my sermon, like I was encourage the people to see to hope the new heaven. So but as you know, the prosperity gospel, it will stick the people in this earth. So how can I use that controversy in my sermon?
How can you use that controversy in your sermon? I think you can do it like you just said, right? I mean, that's an illustration. It's an illustration, and it engages people immediately.
When can I use the controversies?
When they're appropriate for serving the pastoral needs of the church. When you don't want to be the person who is always mentioning controversies, but when there's a pastoral need to mention that, when there are when it helps your proposition to mention it, that's when you can mention it, I think.
I ask you this because here, even some healthy churches, they focus on the exposing the controversy.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah, I think we don't want to be known as the people who are always exposing false teachers. We want to do that, but we don't want to be, when people think of our ministries, we want them to think of the gospel. We don't want them to think of apologetics, I don't think.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah. So then how do we use quotations? Here are some principles. Number one, the shorter the better. The shorter the better. You don't when people are hearing a quotation that's lengthy, they zone out. Short, quick quotations are good. If you can put the quotation on the screen for longer ones, then that's good also. Or even for shorter ones, if you can put the quotation on the screen, that's good. And since you're in an oral setting or an oral setting for people who are listening, when you're avoiding plagiarism, I don't think you need to be as strict in saying, Dr. So-and-so, a PhD in New Testament theology once said this. I think you can just say something simple like someone once said, and then give the quotation, just nodding away from yourself, or one author put it this way. Again, this isn't a research paper. You're making it clear that this isn't your material. But I don't think you don't need to do a citation. On page 596 of N.T. Wright's Paul and the Faithfulness of God, he says this. You don't need to say that. And especially if it's someone like N.T. Wright, who would be more controversial. Peter Enns has perhaps one of the best commentaries on Exodus. However, I don't think I would mention his name from the pulpit because of his association with some views in the historicity of Adam and Genesis. So for him, I might say something like, one author put it this way, without mentioning his name, because you want to be careful who people research when you're done. So those are the big ideas. How to illustrate. The main thing you want to take away is you illustrate for the purpose of explaining the text or giving an example of the application. That's what you're doing. Illustrations serve your explanation, and illustrations serve your application. Any more questions on that before we move to our workshop on illustrations?
Yeah, for indirect quotes, like
yes.
Read something from a commentary, get an idea. Should we just say it? Like, it seemed like if we mentioned every commentary we read, it could come across as just making us look smart.
Yes, I think it does. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, again, it's not a research paper, it's a sermon. So if you're not directly quoting someone, if you've received help from a certain commentary, I think what you can do is this. You can say something like, especially if you're introducing a series, or if you're halfway through a series, you can say something like, I want to make you guys aware of a certain commentary that's really helped me in my sermon preparation, and then just show the commentary, bring a copy of it, give the author's name, put a picture of it on the screen, something like that. And that's fine. If you're not directly quoting him or using his main points every time, if you're just, he's your go-to guy in understanding the text. This is not a research paper, it's a sermon, but you also want to give credit where credit's due. So yeah, I don't think you need to quote every person you read. I don't think you need to even name every person you quote. As long as you're pointing, when you're directly quoting someone or you get an idea from someone else, you're pointing away from yourself, and then you're doing your job right, I think.
Another question, Josh.
Mm-hmm.
Most preachers I know and we listen in YouTube, they often quote a lot.
They quote who? Sorry?
Many quotations. They use many.
Yeah.
For example, if you hear Kevin Dia, there's a lot of quotation in his sermons.
He does, yes.
Even Pannell quotes a lot. So, what do you say about that?
I think. Go ahead.
Do we have to quote a lot, or?
I don't think so. No, I'm inclined to say the less we quote, the better. And when we do quote, we do it strategically. We don't quote because we want people to think that we're smart. We don't quote because We want people to know we're well read. We don't quote because we want to tell people that there are other people who think this, or to say you should read this book. We quote because someone says it better than I ever could. That's the main reason we quote. Someone says it better than I ever could. Let me tell you how they say it. And then we use the quotation, I think.
Josh,
Mhm.
For our context, like here in Ethiopia, we are not that much familiar with the church history and the church fathers, and like even quoting Luther would be like something strange for us. And it's not like the American culture. You get used to the people's, whenever you preach, you mostly quote different church fathers. When it comes to our context, preachers don't frequently quote anyone, and it seems if we quote someone from church history, it most probably be from someone from Europe or the States. So it seems like we abandon our culture and history, and what do you suggest us? Because I want to, there is not that much sense in our culture of the NA culture that it seems like we only have like 100 years of history, not like we don't lean to the church fathers. So what do you suggest us to quote in our sermon?
Oh my goodness. That's a humbling question for you to ask. And I think that's a question you guys can talk about tonight in your dorm room, and you can talk about it better than I ever could. I think the opinions of your brothers are probably better than mine here. My inclination would be, don't do anything that feels awkward to the people listening to you. And if you want to see that done more and more, then be an agent of someone quoting more and more. If you don't, my friend, I'm the last one who would feel qualified to critique you on that. I don't want you to. This is cross-cultural education here, and this is a moment where I, as a cross-cultural teacher, defer to you and your friends for what you think is best.
Thank you.
Yeah, you guys should talk about that tonight. My overarching principle is, don't do something that would be awkward for people. Good. Any other questions?
Just a comment. I think for me personally, one benefit I've had from quotations, yes, as you said, it can be done too much, but I think it can also be helpful. One benefit I derive from it is just showing that, these truths that we preach, these truths that we embrace today, they're not new. Believers for 2,000 years have believed these same truths. So in a sense, I think it just shows that there's unity in the universal church, that Christians have always believed these same truths. So in a sense, I think it's also comforting and encouraging to me, especially when you quote like preachers from long ago, not just present day theologians. And also, I think hearing quotations also helped me to broaden my reading, not just to focus on current books, but also to go back to Puritans, to go back to like even before them. It just helps to broaden our minds, I think. Yeah.
Well said, my friend. Well said.
Yeah. Because I think regardless of where we are in the world, whether we're in China, in Ethiopia, Kenya, I think we are one universal body. So I think it's good to learn from Christians of different ages, different places in the world. I think it's good to learn from them all.
Good. I think you're exactly right. Very helpful, my friend, as always. Any other questions about illustrations before we do our illustration workshop? Okay, so in some senses, this is premature because we haven't talked about application yet, but in some senses, we can already do this. So we're take 30 minutes. I want you to think through. You don't even need to know what the illustration is going to be yet, but first look at your text and ask, is there anything that's difficult to understand? Is there anything that's difficult to understand in this text that people reading it the first time would think, well, what is going on? What is going on here? And it's important for your arguments, right? I want you to observe in the text what needs illustrating. You can think to your applications also. Is there anything in my where I plan to go in my applications that needs illustrating? And think through that, okay? So for your final preaching project, you are going to need to turn in that you've thought through this, what part of the text needs illustrating, and even an idea or two of how you could illustrate it. So I want you to start thinking about that. Look at your text. Is there anything in it that's difficult, cross-cultural, theologically dense, where you could use an illustration? We're not talking about introductions yet. We're not talking about conclusions. We're talking about explanation, especially. And you can start thinking towards application as well. What needs to be illustrated? We got 30 minutes, so until 4 o'clock, and we'll come back together. But does what I just said make sense? You're just looking at your explanation points, looking at the text. Is there anything that needs to be illustrated that would be difficult for people to understand, or that we can make more clear through illustration? Okay, guys, so let's come back together. Hope you found that helpful. And again, you're not finalizing anything now. You're just trying to think through these categories. You're trying to apply them. You're trying to help your neighbor apply them. Any questions at all about what we're doing? Is anything unclear when you try to apply it to your text, or does anyone want to give an example?
Is this on? Mikey and I thought of an example for, I don't know if it's good, but we thought of it. When God says, I am love, just trying to understand what that means. It's not saying God is good or God is rock, like a metaphor. Seems more like Smog saying, I am fire, I am death.
Who's Smog?
The dragon in The Hobbit.
Spell that out for me a little bit more.
Like when it's kind of a, Smog's bad and God's good, but when he says, I am death, I am fire, it's like all that is in fire and death is kind of encapsulating who he's saying he is, which actually makes me realize this isn't a good illustration.
I would want to think about that more. When you get into categories of doctrine of God, you have to be so careful. I would want to think about it some more, but that's interesting. That is very interesting, because we don't normally talk like that, but that's very interesting.
That's the thing. There's almost nothing. I was trying to think of where we use like a virtue as someone.
Yes.
You kind of only can do that with God. So maybe this.
Yeah. I mean, I think with that, you can tell people, like, this is what we can only speak analogously when we call people good, when we call people happy, when we call people joyful, right? God is not joyful. God is not loving. God is love, right? And that's very different than saying God is a loving person. God is love, so that love is not a divine emotion. Love is a divine perfection. And again, you have to be very careful in how you word that. God does not experience love. Love is not something outside of God that comes over him to make his heart flutter. He doesn't know what it's like to have rises and falls in his emotional state, as if love was something that lived outside of him that he taps into somehow. No, God himself is love. So that if love were to cease to exist, God would cease to exist. And if God were to cease to exist, love would cease to exist. Those are the kinds of categories that, now the smog example, that's really interesting. I would need to think more about that, because yeah, we don't talk like that. Everything that is fire is summed up in smog. Everything that is death is summed up in smog. The reason I need to think about it more is because I'm actually tempted to like it. That's why I need to think about it more. But it's also 8 a.m. and I've been up all night, so my brain isn't firing on all cylinders right now.
As you started talking, my concern would be, I think Tolkien with smog is being poetic, and I think God. I think God.
Yeah.
I don't think smog actually is.
Yes, that's certainly true. Yeah, that is certainly true. So any way we talk about God is going to be some kind of analogy. Even when John says God is love, if we think back to our bibliology and prolegomena class, even when John says God is love, it's an analogy, right? Because when we think of love, we think it's not that we can't understand what it means that God is love, or we can't understand what love is, but it is true that none of us truly understand in this to the full degree what God means when he says love, because we only experience, apart from interactions with God, we only experience fallen love. But yeah, it's interesting, man. The sun is light. The sun is heat. But even that is not, those things are that if the sun disappeared, heat would disappear or light would disappear. So it's more than that. You can even make an illustrative point to say, if the sun went away, there would still be artificial light. If God went away, there would be no love. Right? So you can make illustrations like that that help people understand what it means that God is love, but it's very complicated. It's very hard, but that I would definitely try to illustrate that in a few different ways, say it a few different ways. Good, man. Good. Anyone else have something to share or have a question?
Hi, Josh.
Yeah.
What's the difference between illustration and example?
An illustration and an example. Did we use that in our explanation? I think you could say an example is a form of illustration. There's more to illustrations than that. So illustrations can be quotations, they can be lyrics, they can be examples. But if you give here's an example of what I mean, and that can be an illustration. But not every example is an illustration. So that some examples might be an application. So here's an example of what I mean. So we must rejoice in suffering. An example of what I mean is even when you lose everything, you should still rejoice. Even when you're misunderstood, you should still rejoice. Now those are illustrative applications for sure. But yeah, it'd be more than just in describing explanation, I guess is what I'm saying. Good way to think of it.
I was thinking about Abraham, the history of Abraham in my gospel illustration.
Mm-hmm. And in your gospel illustration, how would you plan on using that?
One of my main point is what is the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
When I define gospel, I define and describe gospel and give example as Abraham as an example for someone who believed the gospel.
Righteousness. I think that's a great illustration. And I do think that scripture itself is an untapped mine of illustrations. One illustration that is the Puritans would often quote scripture as illustrations. So one from Jonathan Edwards, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." One illustration that he gives, the famous illustration is like a spider dangling over fire, right? And if the web were to break, the spider would fall into the fire, and we dangle by less than a spider's web over hell, as it were. Like that's the famous one from the sermon, right? But another one that he uses is the story of King Nebuchadnezzar, who ordered that the furnace for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be turned 7 times hotter, because his pride was offended that they would not bow before him. And then he says, "My friends, how much more so the God of the universe? If we refuse to bow before him, how much more will he heat the furnace 7 times hotter for those who refuse to bow before him?" And I think that's a good way to use Bible stories as illustrations. I think we can use those frequently.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah. Any other questions or examples, or you want to share what you are planning on doing?
If I use,
Yeah, AB.
if I used 2 Timothy 4:3, do you think it would serve to kind of give that people want to hear what their ears are aching, and this is the time and age that we're at?
Yeah. So your sermon is on the foolishness of the gospel in the world's eyes. We want to hear what we want and not Christ. Is that right? Yeah, I think you could quote that. I think I would quote verse 4 also. People wandering off to silly myths. I think that's a helpful cross-reference that could even lead into an illustration too. So give that cross-reference, and that kind of gives opportunity for an illustration. Say, for instance, in our own culture, do we not see this exact same thing happening? Yeah, I think that's really, really good, AB. Well done.
I want to use an illustration of when Jesus calls Matthew, because the parable is for the Pharisees. So how Jesus called Matthew while he were a tax collector.
Mm-hmm.
Can I use this as an illustration?
I think so. I think you can, and I think that's a great example. And if you want to, you could even use Nicodemus as well. So Nicodemus is a Pharisee, right? Who Jesus shows the same compassion for Nicodemus that he does for Matthew, and even maybe comparing those two accounts to illustrate he's just as compassionate for the tax collector as he is for the Pharisee. The Pharisee's problem is just that he won't take advantage of that mercy and compassion, or he thinks he doesn't need it. And maybe even quote, Jesus saying, "I did not come to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance." Jesus uses an illustration when he says, those who are well do not need a doctor, right? When we're like the older brother, this might not even be one of your explanation points, right? But this is just an example of Jesus says the same thing. I think that's perfect, Emmanuel. And I would encourage us to tap into the Bible for more illustrations. And I think we talked about this last week when we talked about preaching Christ and not just preaching a redemptive historical hermeneutic. The more we can use examples of Jesus from the Gospels, the better, because that introduces people to the person of Christ and not just a redemptive historical hermeneutic. So I think that's a great example, Emmanuel. Well done.